Welcome to Star Trek Story, Myth, and Arcs podcast. Its 5-year mission to explore Star Trek arcs and themes, seek out new story directions, and boldly tell stories that no one has told before.
Hailing frequencies open, sir.
All right. Welcome to Star Trek Story, Myth, and Arcs podcast. Today we're going to be talking about Star Trek Federation by Judith and Garfield Reeves-Stevens, and I have a special guest, Seth Heasley, who some of you may know from 2 different science fiction podcasts. Primarily, I think a lot of people, well, I don't know which one probably gets more listeners, probably the same. But I was on your podcast, Hugo's There, to talk about Clifford Simak's Way Station. But you're also a host of a show called Take Me to Your Reader. Can you tell people a little bit about your 2 podcasts?
Sure. Yeah. Take Me to Your Reader is the one that I've been doing longer. We've been doing it since 2014. And that's with my buddies, Colin and James. And we talk about adapted science fiction. So we'll look at short stories, novellas, novels that were turned into science fiction movies. And just kind of, mill all that around. And then Hugo's There is the one that you were on. That's where I'm reading through the list of Hugo winners, and I'm letting my guest pick the topic, so I don't have to do them in order.
Right. And so Take Me to Your Reader is the one that kind of made me think that you were the person to do this book with me, because you guys do adaptation where you talk about, and specifically I was thinking about the one that made me think about this one was your episode that you did on The Thing, and the short story Who Goes There, ironically, and and the new coming novel version, weirdly enough, and then, so there's various levels. So you guys talked about the short story, you talked about the original movie, and you talked about the remake. And this book, well, it is one novel, and if you're watching on YouTube, this is the original hardback that I got from the library, and look how old and decrepit and loved this book is.
I feel like I can smell that book.
Yeah, exactly. But Federation, I think, fits with a whole Take Me to Your Reader vibe, in the sense that it kind of affects its tendrils of the story, affect many pieces of Star Trek media, from the original series to Next Generation to the movies. And the question is, can this book live with the canon? Can it not live with the canon? Is it better than what we got in the canon? And there's a lot of levels to it, but let's start with you cannot read this book without watching it's a lost episode of Star Trek. It's not a very important episode of Star Trek, but to this book, it is the foundation of it. So the first thing we're going to talk about is season 2, episode 9 of the original series, written by Gene L. Kuhn, who was Gene Roddenberry's number 2 Gene, working on the show. And pretty much when Roddenberry walked away in protest, Kuhn was the one that kind of kept things going. Right. How important he was to Star Trek. But this episode, Metamorphosis, which would probably have been lost to the annals of Trek, would be one that wouldn't be remembered. And that's why it's so amazing that this novel Federation is kind of a sequel to Metamorphosis. And so, Seth, why don't you give us a little summary of Metamorphosis and what you thought of it?
Okay. So the summary is Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, stop me if you've heard this before, are in a shuttle, and they are taking someone who has a medical emergency.
For reasons, they're not on the Enterprise.
For reasons, yes. They're heading back to the Enterprise to treat Ambassador Hedford. Was that her name?
Yeah, Nancy Hedford.
Nancy Hedford. For a rare disease that she wasn't inoculated for, which she bust their chops for quite a bit. And they get pulled off course by an unknown kind of energy field. And when they land on a planetoid, they discover it's habitable, which it was probably strange, although I'm not sure they remarked on it.
Spock did. He was like, "This is
Okay.
super weird." Yeah.
Yeah, like the gravity is like Earth normal here on this tiny little planetoid. And they meet up with a relatively young man there who introduces himself as Cochrane, and we find out that he is Zephram Cochrane, inventor of warp drive, and
And
he has been. Go ahead.
and importantly, because this is a big difference between Zephyr Cochrane that you would know from First Contact,
Yes,
is that he says, Kirk says, Zephyr Cochrane of Alpha Centauri,
exactly.
which kind of implies the idea that the inventor of the warp drive was not on Earth.
Right.
But they deal with that in the novel.
They do
very well, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's this idea that Zephyr Cochrane, he invented the warp drive
and then disappeared
for reasons,
Mm-hmm.
which are never really explained in the.
No, they're not.
I mean, in the episode. That's what the book does.
Yes.
So I'm sorry to interrupt, but then go ahead. The cloud.
I mean, that's pretty much it, right? You find out that he is living there, and there's also some kind of sentient cloud there that rejuvenates him and keeps him effectively immortal and in his prime. Because when he had disappeared, he was supposed to be, I think, in his 80s, and so they're puzzled by that. But the cloud has brought him there because he's lonely, and the cloud loves him and wants to care for him. And so it brought him playmates. And this, of course, is an emergency because Nancy Hedford is dying.
Yeah.
And the onset of symptoms happens while she's there, and it progresses quite rapidly. And how much do we want to spoil about
I think we can go. I mean, it's an episode of the original series, but I would say that if you are planning on reading this book and you haven't seen the episode, pause.
Yeah.
Go watch the episode, come back, read the book. And then we're going to spoil everything. I think is the idea. We're going to assume that since this is one of the most popular Star Trek novels of all time, that a lot of the people that are going to be listening to this episode have already read it.
Yeah.
And I do think we should spoil it. But one kind of mistake I saw in what Gino Kuhn was trying to do with this episode was to tell a weird romance.
Yes.
To have like what they thought was a really sweet answer to all this, but it's kind of horrifying to think of the idea that you're gonna die and like give up your body to this other being so it can enjoy the romance with this dude. Yes. It's a little weird. It's a little problematic. I think that if the episode had originally set up the idea that her disease was that she was already a goner, I think a little bit more so. One might have been less cringy. And
more so than, oh, sorry I killed you, but by the way, can I borrow your body?
Exactly. Sorry I brought you to this planet and caused you to die.
Yeah.
Now let me be a corporeal being so I can be with my
so I can make sweet, sweet love with Cochrane.
Yes, and that may sound like you're making fun of that, but one of the most ridiculous things about this episode is when they first turn on the universal translator and talk to the companion, and Kirk's like, "Oh, it's obviously a feminine voice," and they gender this cloud of gas as being clearly a woman, which is ridiculous. But
well, they even say male and female is a universal thing, right?
Yeah, and so this is the most out of date politically. I think that if you were writing this now, it would just be the companion, and it fell for Cochrane. And it may be convenient that it was a woman who was dying here. And
right. Yeah, I think if you were doing it today, you would have a little more consent brought into it, where she was going to die, and she said, "Look, I'm okay with this."
Yeah, she kind of does, and I think they do try to establish that to a small degree, but not enough. I think
not a lot of agency for
Hedford. Yeah,
Nancy,
yeah. I mean, because she's obviously so sick and dying that she's like out of it, and so for whatever she feels about it, it's hard to say. But
I had not seen this episode since I was probably, I don't know, 14.
Yeah, I want to come back
since it
to
was
that. I want to
okay.
come back to your final thoughts on it. But before
Okay.
we do that, one of the things that I think is interesting in this episode, well, you know, and that's funny is like it would be interesting if, you know, the companion had chosen Bones, you know,
Right.
like how Cochran would have felt of
Hey,
it.
but on the name alone, I know he
Yeah,
likes to
yeah.
party.
And we just you know, I don't know, but it's not the best episode. It's not
No.
a great episode. But one of the things that's amazing to me about it is that as a fan of this novel, Star Trek Federation, now this episode takes on way different meaning. And for
Hmm.
me, going back and rewatching it for this episode, which I did before, I went back and watched this episode before reading Federation for my third time.
Hmm.
And it does make the episode better. If you
Yes.
know what's coming, if you know like the story, because it gives you details into why he left Earth,
Hmm.
it does make it does make it a little better.
Yeah. I will say it's not completely required. There's enough in the book that explains what happened.
Yeah, it's not completely required, but I do think it makes it better if
Yeah.
you've seen it. And of the three times that I read it, the first time I read it, I had only my memory of having seen the episode of having seen
Mm.
all the episodes, and I did fine.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
so although I was Trek nerd enough to know as soon as it said the companion, I knew which one
Oh,
it
okay.
was. So because I'm that big of a nerd, and I read Federation when it first came out in hardcover in '94.
Hmm.
And so we had less Trek to memorize at that point.
It is true.
So, and I'll have thoughts on the differences of reading it then and reading it now too at some point.
Hmm.
So the episode overall, like you said, this was the first time you'd seen it. When was the
For a
last
long time. Yeah.
when was the last time you rewatched all of Trek, or is it just your experience of watching it?
Boy, I'm not sure that I could say I've rewatched all of original Trek since like it's been available on streaming. I just kind of picked my spots, watched a few episodes here and there, mostly
This
because
is
by the
not one
time
you would pick. No one would
no,
pick this episode and be like,
no, nobody would.
that's one I got to watch. It's no Balance of Terror. It's no Arena.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. There's some fantastic episodes, and I did go back and watch those. I think I watched the entire first season. But I haven't watched the rest of it. I watched just a smattering of them kind of over time. I watched a lot more of TNG on Netflix just because that was more my series, right?
Right.
I think you and I are similar age, right? Graduated in 91, I did.
Yeah, you're 1 year ahead of me, and
Okay.
but I was an early adopter for. I mean, I watched Next Generation when it
Yeah.
premiered, so I've
Hmm.
watched it from the beginning. But I have more love in my heart for the original series than I do.
Okay.
So
Yeah, and it was appointment television for us. It was on in syndication in Anchorage at 5 p.m. every night, and
same
we'd
for us
drop what we were
in
doing
Indiana.
and come in and watch it.
Yeah.
So it would play I think it would play original series, and then it would play Buck Rogers, and it would just kind of keep flipping back and forth. So
Well, I would say TOS holds up better than Buck Rogers. The last
I would
time I tried
agree.
to watch it.
I would agree. Although having watched some of Buck Rogers recently,
Ooh,
it was a ton of fun.
it's not good.
No. We actually did an episode of Take Me to Your Reader about Buck Rogers because it was adapted.
I missed that. I'll have to look
Yeah.
through the feed for that because I've
Yeah.
listened to a lot of Take Me to Your Reader, and
Yeah.
for some reason I've never watched that one. That'll be interesting.
Yeah.
So, anyways, final thoughts on Metamorphosis as a rewatch.
Yeah, I mean it's not much of an episode really. I thought it was most interesting just because of the character Zephyr Cochrane. And this is something I wanted to talk to you about because I have a lot of different strands in my head that I've read from various Star Trek novels and different properties about how that first contact happened, how the first warp trip happened, because I had remembered in my head, oh yeah, well he was from Alpha Centauri, and that had put it in my head that he was actually an alien, and then it wasn't a human who created it.
Well, and with a name like Zephyr Cochrane, Zephyr's
Right.
not like a really. It's not like, oh, that's a very typical Jewish name. I mean, although he is from the late 21st century, so maybe Zephyr's
Mhm.
in like Brittany or
Sure.
something.
Is Cochrane a variant of Cohen, maybe?
I don't know, but yeah, there are various threads as to what First Contact was.
Right.
I know there
And
was
what happened with Cochrane himself?
exactly, and um, but of course these novels are not officially canon, and
Right.
so, like I know there was like Strangers in the Sky was a
Yep.
Margaret Bono
I
story.
read that one. Yeah.
Yeah, First Contact, and that was a good First Contact with Vulcan story. Although now it's
Yeah.
gone.
They used elements of it for Star Trek First Contact, right?
Yeah, and having the First Contact be with Vulcans, I think, comes
Hmm.
back to that. But
I think you mean Vulcanians.
Vulcanians, yeah, um, Vulcania, um,
Yes.
and well, what's interesting about that from a storytelling perspective is that uh, we learned on this podcast a little tip of the hat to, or patting myself on the back like a helicopter taking off. But we
Hmm.
learned from John J. Ordever on his interview that we did here, even though this book was before his time, although he is acknowledged in the acknowledgments of the book.
Yeah.
Um, John mentioned that he was in regular communication with the current writers during his tenure about
Right.
trying to keep the canon. And one of the
Right.
people he regularly talked to was Ron Moore.
Hmm.
And it's Ron Moore who co-wrote the book that took a big dump on Federation and knocked it out of canon ish.
Hmm.
So they were talking, they weren't talking. Who knows? I
Right.
mean,
Yeah, and that's always the question of, right, who decides what the canon is?
right. And I think the problem that we're going to eventually run into here when we start talking about First Contact, and I know you're not as huge of a fan of First Contact. I personally do like First Contact as a movie.
Hmm.
However, I do not like how um, doesn't stay true to the canon and with
Yeah.
Zephyr Cochrane. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. We'll get to that once we,
Hmm.
But I think it does relate to Metamorphosis because
Yeah.
I'm wondering if anyone. It seems like Brandon Braga and Ron Moore, when they wrote First Contact, could have at least gone and watched this episode like we did
Hmm.
for reading this book, and it seems like they took the name and just said, okay, yeah, that's a good name, and then ejected the rest of the story. So,
Yeah.
and it's not like Metamorphosis is, I mean, it's an actual episode. It's not like it was a novel.
Right.
It should be canon. It is
Hmm.
canon. And if we're going to be consistent about all of it, and look, there's a little bit of hand waving I'm okay with
Yeah.
because like, I'm fine that the Klingons don't look exactly the same. Like
Yeah. Me too.
I can do that in my head.
Hmm.
Fine.
Yeah.
But if you change their behavior too much or whatever, and I know
Yeah.
they hadn't invented the Klingon language yet, so that's those are all
Sure.
things. However, I think this is just the fact that they ignored this episode to me is a little bit lazy, completely.
Yeah.
But what did not ignore this episode was the book Star Trek Federation, written by Judith and Garfield Reeves-Stevens.
Yes.
And so I think we could segue into the book now.
Yeah. Hey, I wanted to ask you, how many Star Trek novels have you read? Have you ever tallied it up?
Oof. That is not as easy for me to tally as it is my Hugo winners, which
Oh, nice.
um, during the time that I lived in Syracuse during the second half of the 90s, which was
Hmm.
the John J. Ordever era, which is one of the reasons why that episode that I did was such a big deal for me.
That was
Uh,
a great episode, by the way.
yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. Um, during that 5-year period, and I was kind of in and out of college at the time, and the only reading I had so much reading to do
Hmm.
for college, for school, that the only fun reading I could manage to get my brain around was Star
Hmm.
Trek,
Yeah,
because I didn't have to think about the characters.
exactly.
Yeah, because the characters
Hmm.
are already formed in my head, which is one of the reasons
Hmm.
why the New Frontier books were never as fun for me at the
Hmm.
time. But I think now I will really appreciate them.
Hmm.
So I'm
And were you mostly an original series
no,
novel?
I read all Star Trek
Okay.
novels, and I probably read over 100 in
Wow.
that period.
Yeah, I was tallying it up. I think I'm close to 40 of them, and they're mostly TNG. I've sprinkled in a few of the more well-known TOS ones
Yeah,
and
and
a couple Deep Space Nine. But
yeah, and pretty much I would read anyone that I could get my hands on at the time. And there was a used bookstore in Syracuse that was really close to me, and somebody went in and sold, like, would buy whatever was new,
mm-hmm.
read it, and sell it to this store almost instantly. But I
Mm.
was looking at the other day, I was looking at the Star Trek New Frontier, and what they would do is in the back cover, the front and the back cover, they would list all the books that were coming out for the year,
Oh,
the
okay.
checklist. So
Mm-hmm.
you knew Ordiver was thinking ahead and he wrote them all out. And
Mm-hmm.
I would basically, at the beginning of the year, I would check through and I would read all of them. And
Nice.
as they came out,
Mm-hmm.
and if I didn't have one to read at any given time, I'd go back and read the older ones. And what's
Mm-hmm.
funny is the ones that were the Bantam before Pocket, I was not as big a fan of
Mm-hmm.
at the time. But now there's so many big names like your Joe Handelmans, your Greg Bears, and people that wrote ones before that era
Yeah.
that are big name science fiction writers. I've recently gone back and read some of them. And what's interesting is that they only have the original series to build off of.
Yeah.
So they're completely different,
Mm-hmm.
and fun in a different way.
Yeah.
And they're kind of pure in that way, is that they don't have the additional canon to build off of.
Mm-hmm.
But in that, and so, like, a lot of times, like, I was, because it was winter, and a lot of times if I rode my bike everywhere, even back then before it was cool in Syracuse. But whenever it was snowy, I had to ride the bus, and my bus reads were always Star Trek.
Yeah.
I had a job where I sat alone at the desk for a long time. I could not study at work because I just couldn't concentrate. So I read Star Trek books at work,
Mm-hmm.
because I worked at a health food store where nobody ever came inside, and it was at a mall. And so literally I have sense memories of, and when I was rereading Federation, I could picture myself at the health
Yeah.
food store, sitting there reading it for the first time, because I remember I would knock out 150 pages of this book,
Mm-hmm.
most on a shift at Nature Food Center in the Carousel Mall in Syracuse. And a lot of the books, when I was talking to John J. Ordiver about it, a lot of the books, like, all came back to me that way. Like, I remembered when we were talking about the Sulu's Daughter book, I remembered I was filling in at a different store.
Mm-hmm.
I remember it very clearly. But anyways, I don't
Yeah.
think
It's funny how that works with books. I have a lot of books that are that way as well.
Yeah. So Federation was one that I got as a hardcover when it came out, and this was one that they put posters up in bookstores. So the image of Kirk and Picard together on the cover was a huge selling point, and was something that us Star Trek readers were really excited about, because Borders and Barnes and Nobles had posters in the sci-fi section for the book before release. And this was right before Generations came out, right?
Right.
Generations was on its way. And so, you know what? Actually, I think I was in Dayton, Ohio when this came out, actually. And I think the second time I read it, I read it in Syracuse. Actually, so yeah, so now that I appreciate it, I might have actually read this 4 times now. I'm thinking about it, because I was in Dayton, because now I remember buying it in Dayton. And I remember Generations was one of the last movies I saw in Dayton before I moved to Syracuse. And so this came out before Generations, and this was the first time that we got the crews together, in a sense.
Right.
This book was a big event. It was a hardcover release. It was not numbered, which in Star Trek terms, that's like all the pocket editions are numbered, like 1 through 500 at the time, for each part of the franchise, for Next Generation, for Voyager, and so the big hardcovers, your big Peter David bestsellers, your cute novels, they weren't numbered. And so if it wasn't numbered, it was a big deal. It was like, this is a must read one. And I don't know how the authors felt like, or if they got excited like, ooh, there's no number.
Right.
But Federation was non-numbered, and maybe let's go over what the plot is and review the plot a little bit.
Sure.
One of the things I love about Federation is that it is. I'm a big plot and structure guy, and I love the fact that we have 3 stories and 3 timelines in Federation.
Yeah.
So it takes place over 3 centuries, 4 centuries, really. And there are very few, it's hard for a novel to span that many centuries. Probably the best example of that would be your Canonical for Leibowitz.
Yeah.
And for a Star Trek novel to do that, and I'm not throwing shade on Star Trek authors because I have a lot of respect for the authors that write for Star Trek, but the literature world looks down on tie-in novels for whatever reason. And this is a fantastically plotted novel that spans 300 years. And the main thing that's the foundation of it is the episode Metamorphosis. And what you have is, I think a good jumping point for the story is that when Cochrane says in Metamorphosis that he went into deep space, that he left, that we really don't, Gene L. Kuhn never explained in his episode why Cochrane left.
Right.
And so this novel is about why Cochrane left. And also it answers a question that in our last episode here on Star Trek and Horror, we touched on just briefly, which is that there's this constant asking of how does Star Trek get from all the chaos and horrible stuff we're dealing with to the utopia?
Right.
And I think this book does a really good job of that.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's little nods here and there in some of the movies in The Next Generation, for instance, when they talk about the post-atomic horror. But yeah, there's a more comprehensive history
And Deep
here.
Space Nine with the Bell riots, which seem particularly prescient right now, considering especially what's going on in the city just near you right now. And so, I mean, Star Trek did touch on it later, but at the time, this was unknown territory for the writers. And so, in this story, Cochrane invents the warp drive and takes his first stroll with his warp drive to Alpha Centauri, and you get the idea that he's part of founding a colony on Alpha Centauri, which explains the whole Zephyrin Cochrane from Alpha Centauri. Right. He's not an alien. He is human. He came from Earth, but he planted his flags for in Alpha Centauri, and what happens back on Earth is one of the reasons why the colonists are leaving is because there is post-atomic horror on Earth. Things are really, really terrible, and there's this political movement called the
Optimum.
Optimum.
Yeah.
Now, I have to say,
it's actually even before World War III.
Yeah, they kind of kick it off, right? Yeah. And their leader is this guy, Colonel Adric Thorne, and this guy, this villain, I've seen some reviews where people have said that he's very cartoony. He's a cartoony villain, and he is.
Yeah, especially toward the latter end of the book.
Yes, he's very cartoony, but I think he rules. I think
he totally does. Yeah.
Yeah, I think he is one of the best Trek villains outside of Khan. And I say that, I know it's a novel. Thorne is an incredible villain, and we'll get to the nitty-gritty on why that is, but he is obsessed. His white whale is Cochrane, and he believes Cochrane has invented something called hold on one second.
He calls it a warp bomb, I think, doesn't he?
Yeah, so they call it, Thorne believes that he invented something called the warp bomb.
Right.
And that
based on an accident that happened.
Right. And Cochrane says this doesn't exist, but Thorne is obsessed with the warp bomb and having the warp bomb. Like he has to have it.
Right.
And so the idea is that, and this is a great explanation for why Cochrane would take off, is that this guy Thorne has spent decades obsessed with and killed all the people that he cares about, and will not stop until he gets this warp bomb. So Cochrane has to take off and go hide. And at this point, that can still all coincide with what's going on in First Contact, technically. That's not the problem with the later canon, but so this is driving the plot, because this obsession with Cochrane and getting the warp bomb is what drives the story of Federation.
Right.
Because what you find out in Federation is that and Metamorphosis ends with Kirk saying, "Don't worry, Zephyrin, I won't tell anyone that you're here."
Right.
And what's really interesting about this, and that makes the world feel more lived in Star Trek, is the idea that, because at the time in the original series, like, no matter what happened in an episode, it was just dropped and we just moved on, and nothing had consequences. And one of the things that's cool about this novel is that it grounds Star Trek in two big ways. Well, it does in both the next gen parts and the original series parts, is that it puts it in the timeline right after the events of Journey to Babel. So Kirk's still smarting from getting stabbed in the back by a fake Andorian. And, Sarek is on board the ship, which is important for connective tissue.
Yes.
And so what they're doing here is, or it's the kind of what ties it all together, is that Kirk made a personal log that he had sealed, that later on people could find out that Cochrane was there after some time that Cochrane would have naturally passed away.
Right. I guess we didn't talk about that part of the episode, that essentially the companion and Cochrane would both be mortal now because she had given up the pure energy form.
Right. And that's very important to the novel as well, so what you find out is that Thorne has put this malware software basically in the Starfleet database, looking for any sign of discovery of Cochrane out there. And that he has kept himself alive by becoming a cyborg, and by taking illegal banned cybernetic technology to keep himself alive, which is really great villainy.
It is. Yeah, from the Grigari.
Yeah. And he's very mustache twirly, but and as soon as Kirk puts this in his personal log, even though it's sealed, his malware finds it, and he's able to go and hire a bunch of Klingon ships and Orion
pirates,
and they kidnap Cochrane, and the companion desperately calls on Kirk to come help her save Cochrane.
Right. And that message is intercepted by Starfleet Command.
And they send the mealy mouth admiral, which is a running thing in the original series, is the Commodores, or the people who try to take Kirk's command.
Yep.
And I didn't mind that character as much, the admiral.
No.
I think.
No, I like the fact that there was some question that you could see that the admiral might think that Kirk was bent in some way, and Kirk could definitely feel like, well, is the admiral in on this conspiracy though? Right.
So
it was believable.
Yeah, and that was really great writing and reversal and parallel there with them in that situation. And then, which leads to, we find out that they're being held, the hostages with Cochrane are being held on this cruise liner called the Utopia Planitia.
Right.
And then, but at the same time, we're getting storylines that involve the Next Generation crew, and that all those scenes take place right after Sarek's mind meld with Picard in season 3. Now, there are 2 reasons why that happened. There's a real world reason and there's a story reason.
Okay.
One is that if you look in the back of the book in the acknowledgments, the Judith and Garfield Reeves-Stevens, it said that they had pitched this idea during season 3 of Next Gen, which so that Sarek episode was a recent episode. But Dave Stern, who was the editor before John J. Ordover, told the Reeves-Stevens that it was too early to combine the crews, and so they continued to keep their story set in the 3rd season of Next Generation, because that's when their story, they'd kind of outlined the story and had it ready. But it also made story sense because Picard's mind meld with Sarek puts him, gives him a connection to the Enterprise at that point, which I think only plays like a real brief little thing later, but it does that whole thing of grounding it. And giving it a sense for, because as nerds of the show, we're like, oh yeah, I remember when he mind melded with Sarek. Oh, it's interesting that this happened the same week, you know? And at first, when you're reading this novel, was this your first time reading Federation?
Yeah, it was.
Yeah,
and it's my first Star Trek novel in, I don't know, 15 years.
Wow. Yeah, it's good way to come back. Unfortunately, the bar's so high now. I don't know.
I know. Well, I was thinking, because I just started doing a series on Hugo's there on comfort reads, so just letting people, if they want to talk about murder mysteries or whatever. And as I was reading this, I was like, man, I could totally do an episode on Star Trek novels. Because like they were my grab one at an airport bookstore and get on a plane and read.
Yep. I mean, that's the story of my reading 100 of them. So what's going on here in the story is that we have the 3 timelines. We have the backstory with Cochrane, we have the Enterprise, and we have Enterprise D storylines. And these are well spaced out, and there's a really good rhythm between them. And then eventually there's a lot of cliffhangers between one, and you're going to have to get part of this storyline. The Cochrane story, the backstory drops off after the first third because we've kind of moved into the future events. And once we figure out that Thorne is the one behind taking Cochrane, and that's all done really, really well.
Yeah.
One of the things I like about how the Reeves-Stevens write Star Trek, and I think it comes through really well in their original series stuff, more so than the Next Gen stuff, is they do a really good job of making the Enterprise feel like a functioning vessel.
Yes.
And one of the best scenes in this novel, and just amazing Star Trek, is the hostage rescue of the Utopia Planitia.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Yeah. Because it feels like a real operation. There's a throwaway line where they talk about the medical teams lining up outside the transporter room ready to give medical aid to the hostages. And I was like, God, that is just a great detail. That just really makes it feel great. But what it really is you have the Admiral has no idea what to do.
Right.
And then Kirk has to take back command, of course, because that's such a Kirk thing to do.
Yeah.
And all the main characters of Star Trek, Spock, Uhura, Sulu, Scotty, everybody plays a role in this rescue. And it's one of the things that's just as a writer, as a storyteller, but also as a Star Trek fan, combining those two loves, rereading this chapter, I was floored. Reading this part, because I thought, my God, they nailed it. And it's helpful that they're a married couple and they are both nerds for this stuff, and they could probably sit there and throw back ideas. They didn't have to do it alone, which is great. And but this scene, I don't know. Tell me your feelings on this scene. Like,
I mean, I wrote down, like, I hadn't started writing down anything, and I was reading late in the night the other night, just trying because I was only like 20% through the book. And I'm like, I got to get halfway through before I go to bed tonight. And I got to this part and completely got my second wind and couldn't put it down. And
That's
I
funny. That's
love
the
the
time of
fact,
night I was reading this part.
yeah, yeah. And the part that makes it work so well is the adversary is good enough, because Kirk is like, okay, this is a freighter, you know, or a passenger liner, right? It doesn't have really strong shields. Let's just target the shield emitters. And then he realizes there's hostages at the shield emitters, and so he has to come up with a different way to disable them.
Mhm.
And that whole scene where he's like, okay, Admiral, you need to negotiate. So take the chair, and you're going to negotiate with I think it was a Klingon that was
Yeah.
on there, right?
Yeah.
And then they go down to, I just thought of it as the battle bridge.
The auxiliary bridge. Yeah.
Yeah. And you know, run simulations and scenarios, and like, okay, so you got to do this, Chekhov, you got to do this, Spock, can we do that, you know? And then the way it plays out, it's so good. It's just everything
In
but
it,
jazz.
they're functioning like a crew, like a real
Yes.
crew, like trained professionals, like
Hmm.
that, and they're running their simulations and they're doing their thing, and it makes it's like all the dust in Star Wars that makes it feel more real.
Yeah,
It's
yeah, yeah.
the same kind of thing, because it's like,
Hmm.
yeah, they're a functioning crew, and in a way that sometimes even the show doesn't capture.
Yeah,
And I just, oh man, yeah. And
yeah.
the actual action of where, you know, one person gets sent out of the airlock, they lose
Hmm.
one hostage, and you know, you get to see everybody do their part. It's great. It's just
Yeah, yeah.
excellent action.
Another thing that's really good about the book is, like you said, the cliffhanger transitions between the various phases. And so it would often transition from the TOS storyline to the TNG storyline
Mhm.
on a similar beat, and pick
Yeah.
it up as if the TOS events were happening in the TNG timeline. And so like it would end with and then they got hit by the phaser fire, right? And then the first thing that you'd see on the TNG side was, you know, shields to maximum, because
Right.
they're also in an encounter like that.
Right, and anybody who knows anything or has listened to my podcast knows that parallels and reversals are absolutely
Yes.
the fundamentals of what I consider storytelling, and those parallels and
Hmm.
how they set them up and the structure and the plotting is just this
Yeah.
this just speaks to my heart. You know,
Yeah.
they did such an amazing job, and what they did was too is not only did they um, transition from one timeline to the other,
Hmm.
but they kept action going. They had parallel action going,
Hmm.
and they also have you going, oh man, I got to find out what happens to the original Enterprise, but
Right.
now I got to find out what happens to Enterprise D,
Hmm.
and I got to keep reading, and it's genius level of page turning, of keeping
Yeah.
you turning the pages.
Yes. Narrative greed.
Yes, and also at the same time, the characterizations of Cochrane and Hedford are really good,
Hmm.
and they also like take what is like kind of a melodramatic, not so great episode that you really wouldn't care about, and gives them a depth and feeling that makes you like really concerned for, you want the companion to find Cochrane,
Right.
and you feel that fear that the companion has that
Hmm.
Cochrane's going to die on the Utopia Planitia.
Right.
So what goes on in the story too is that at first you're reading the TNG thing and you're like, hey man, how does this connect? How does it, you know? And then
Hmm.
you find out that Thorne has, um, in the original series part, he has to follow the Enterprise in order to get away. Thorne has 3 Klingon vessels,
Hmm.
and you know, you could be typical to say, and this is the astronomy nerd in me liking that the Reeves-Stevens made this concrete science fiction, instead of just saying, well, we'll just find a random nebula just like Wrath Khan and we'll go into
Right.
the nebula and hide, is that there might not be a nebula nearby.
Right.
And there isn't a nebula nearby, but there is a black hole, which
Hmm.
is can help you hide, but it's also extremely dangerous.
Right.
And and I do want to mention too, what an incredible scene. And it's a it's a visual. Let's see if I can find it. The scene where, and we kind of glossed over some of the Optimum back storyline, but that stuff is really good characterization too.
Yeah.
Because it really sets up the white whale aspect, the Les Miserables, Javert thing between Thorne and Cochrane.
Yeah.
And there's a really awesome part where he explains why the warp bomb doesn't work and how warp power works.
Oh, right. He draws how the fields interact.
And you see that the Star Trek emblem that they wear on their the pin, the Starfleet pin, is a Cochrane warp field.
Right. And it explains why the two nacelle design is ideal too.
The nacelle design works with hand wavium science and
yep.
And it's great. It ties, and you know what that does is it takes the title Federation, and it really tells you how this story is so fundamental to the backbone of all of it, of all of Star Trek. It makes it an epic story that spans the founding of all of this, and but it also sets up the Moby Dick, the White Whale,
right. Well, and that also sets up too the whole focusing on the Federation aspect of it really sets up that crucial moment inside the Singularity when it's the prisoner's dilemma, which is fantastic.
Yeah, and we'll get to that here in a minute. So they go to the black hole, and all we know at this point in the story, we still haven't figured out how the TNG thing connects, but the Enterprise 1701, the original, is trying to get away from Thorne and the ships. And there's a really excellent scene where Cochrane basically comes up with this plan where I can escape into the Singularity, I can hide, and I can come out in a couple days. And then
when the reinforcements arrive,
yeah, and Thorne will think that I died in the Singularity because he wouldn't be crazy enough to go, because I can go into the black hole with this shuttle. I don't know how they could do that, but with the hand wavium science, I can go hide with a small ship, but wouldn't want to take a big ship in there. And then Cochrane takes his small little shuttle with the companion, and they go into the Singularity to hide from Thorne. And Thorne takes his Klingon
battle cruiser
and dives it in. And there's a great scene where, and this is great Star Trek. This is great knowing the characters, where Kirk is like, Scotty, we got to go in the black hole. And he's like, are you crazy, Captain? We can't do that. And then he's like, well, this Klingon D7 cruiser just went in there. And he's like,
exactly.
That bucket of bolts? Well, they can do it. We can do it too. And that's great Star Trek characterization, because we all know Scotty is very competitive about the Enterprise being the best.
He called the Enterprise a garbage scow.
Yeah, exactly. It recalls Trouble with Tribbles.
Yep.
And so the Enterprise, once Thorne, we think, dives into the Singularity to get Cochrane, the Enterprise goes in after them. And keep in mind that this black hole is subject to relative time dilation. So what's really cool about that is that there is a really cool mention of the science in there, where McCoy mentions at one point that, hey, we're still in there 100 years from now.
Right.
Like, we may have come out, but in another sense, the Enterprise is still there, which is a really cool geeky moment for the science.
That one reminds me of Gateway. Have you read that one, Friedrich Pohl?
Yes.
Yeah. There's a moment like that where there's someone has to abandon somebody, and he realizes one of the painful parts of it is he's still abandoning her
at all
because of the way the time dilation works.
Yeah, I have not read that book in 25 plus years. So, but yeah, I know the scene that you're talking about.
Yeah.
And so how this connects to the TNG storyline, of course, is that we later learn that Thorne is alive, as basically the robotic computer parts of his brain is continuing on.
Right. His personality matrix.
His personality matrix is continued, and he I'm brain farting how he does this, but he gets on the Enterprise D. He initially takes over the computer, but then takes over data, and takes the Enterprise at maximum warp towards the same singularity.
Right.
And
because he knows that's when Cochrane's going to come back out.
He knows Cochrane's going to come back out, so he's ready and prepared to get Cochrane. And so what's so great about this, about, everyone makes, because one of the best one of the best villains in Star Trek is Khan, and the reason why Khan is such a great villain is that he fucking hates our captain.
Yep.
He hates him. He wants him dead. He is obsessed with getting him. And
and more important than beating him is having Kirk know that he beat him.
Right. And in this sense, this story has a villain who has spent 400 years, has given up all of his humanity in every shape and form just to get Cochrane and to get his warp bomb. And it is next level villainy.
Yeah.
And the fact that he's gotten to the point where now he's nothing but a personality matrix that's taken over this other ship. How do you defeat that? How and one of the things, the best, to me, some of the best Star Trek adversaries are the ones that, like, I'm a defender of the original, of the motion picture, and a lot of people aren't, but one of the things I like about the motion picture is there's nothing Kirk can shoot at.
Right.
In it. He can't arm phasers or, send a photon torpedo at Vizier. It's not going to do him any good. And what I like is that we still get the action adventure parts of this novel at times, but in the end, none of that stuff has worked to stop Thorne to this point. And so what ends up happening is both Enterprises have gone into the singularity, and we have them both there, and they are outside of time inside the black hole, and they're circling inside this bubble inside the black hole, which is kind of hand-wavy science fiction. But, and this is where you can't not compare it to Star Trek Generations.
Yes. Because
Star Trek Generations is when, in the movies, we had Kirk and Picard meet, and we had the crews kind of cross over, and the Enterprise B and whatever. And so they end up in Generations, they end up in the Nexus, and they're out of time, and they make breakfast, ride horses. But think about how much better the connection is in Federation when they see each other.
Right.
They kind of know each other. They can't communicate because it would break the timelines. But in a moment of just, Kirk sends a message, right? And they have the prisoner's dilemma, where in order to get out, they have to work together, but they have to trust the other side to do the right thing.
Right.
And there's all these great scenes where, Spock and Kirk don't know who's on the Enterprise D. They see it.
Right. Or if anyone's on it.
Yeah. But Riker and the Enterprise D, they are like Wesley says, well, Spock was awesome, and if he's on there, he's going to figure it out.
Right.
They have to figure out the timeline. Is this how the Enterprise was destroyed or not? And this,
you get some of the kind of temporal prime directive stuff in there, because it eventually is Worf that's like, the stories, the official story is not correct. There were people on board the Enterprise when it was blown up,
and it comes down to. The whole reason why Worf knows this is not the way that the Enterprise died is because Klingons died in the destruction of the Enterprise, but the official record doesn't show that anyone died. And the fact that we've come so far that the Klingons weren't even considered life to be lost on there, that is neat Star Trek storytelling. It is,
yeah. It's very relevant too.
Yes. and it's a very subtle little moment, but it is one of the things that makes this novel so brilliant.
Yep.
But one of the best moments in this whole book that makes the connection between the two crews so much better and more emotional and so much more powerful than anything we got in Generations is that when they make the decision to follow the prisoner's dilemma, like, we have to work together, I have to assume that this person, that this other crew is going to do the right thing. Kirk says, I don't know who's on that ship, but I know what ship it is. And if they're on the Enterprise, they got to be someone that we can trust.
Now, I trust the Federation values, right?
I trust the Federation values. Yeah, maybe the Enterprise B captain got better over time, but because maybe he wouldn't have trusted Harriman quite as much.
I think he was right in the desk right after the events in Generations.
Yeah, maybe, but I mean, he had to do something to become the captain of the Enterprise. Besides take a day off with Ferris Bueller, but
exactly.
But in any case, this is awesome parallel storytelling. It brings all the elements together. It's great weaving of storyline, and it's one of the things that makes this novel incredible. And I do honestly think, like, I've been working on my review that I'm going to post on my blog, and I refer to this as the Citizen Kane of Star Trek novels. And I did see the other day when I just I looked up Judith and Garfield Reeves-Stevens to see if they were on Twitter. They're not. But when I looked it up, I saw that Michael Gudica, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name right. He's the guy who wrote the technical manuals, the Star Trek technical manuals. And he worked on the actual shows. And he was asked what his favorite Star Trek novel was, and he basically said Federation. Is there any other answer? I think universally this is considered to be the best Star Trek novel. There's a lot of other Star Trek novels I like. I can't imagine reading another Star Trek novel 4 times. I would probably read Prime Directive again. I think Prime Directive was very good.
That was a good one.
Judith and Garfield Reeves-Stevens. And I can tell you that I had stopped reading Star Trek novels. I had kind of burned out on them when their trilogy of Deep Space Nine novels came out, but I was like, okay, I got to read that. And and they were very good too. Basically, before we get to the movies and the discussion of canon, just overall, like, any final, like, now that you've read it, like, what was your experience reading this book for the first time, and overall, how did you feel? I mean, I gleaned some of your feelings.
I mean, obviously it was a terrific experience. It's non-trivial to cross over the generations. I mean, obviously from the movie Generations, we know that maybe that doesn't always work, right? And there's a couple times, like on Deep Space Nine, they did some crossover, right? The Trials and Tribulations.
Well, and Next Gen with Scotty and Spock and
and so I feel like the level
of
difficulty,
and McCoy passing the baton in the
pilot. In the pilot, but it's a high level of difficulty, and the fact that they pulled it off as well as they did is really, really impressive. And we didn't even really talk about the TNG side of it, where you have the Picard archaeology side, and the Borg tie-in as well. And that scene with the ramming speed in it is fantastic.
And it's before they actually did ramming speed in Nemesis. And it's funny because when Nemesis came out and they had the ramming speed scene, I was like, hey, I read that somewhere.
I know where you got that.
Yeah. And I will say that that's the only scene I liked in Nemesis. So
the one other thing that you didn't mention, because it has the 3 time frames, but there's also a tiny little framing narrative that I thought was kind of cool. It ties it into the City on the Edge of Forever.
On Ellison Station.
Exactly. Nice nod there.
And the Guardian Forever. I did almost forget about that.
So one other thing that I wrote down was, when's the last time you watched The Cage, the original pilot, or even the Menagerie?
I've watched both in the last year. So
Okay. So
yeah,
you have that famous statement from Pike, I just can't get used to a woman on the bridge.
right.
Um, and you're like, wow, okay, that's pretty regressive for 22nd century or
Yeah.
23rd century, I guess it is.
Mm.
But there is actually in this book just a little bit of a retcon about that, about moving out into colonies, and there being kind of a more conservative move on the colonies because there was an emphasis on growing the colonies and probably emphasis on family values and all that kind of stuff. I thought that was fascinating because Cochrane himself actually kind of is like, whoa, that's kind of a short skirt on that gal. Did she forget to get dressed? And
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah,
so
yeah. That did go over my head. So
yeah,
good catch.
yeah,
Uh, yeah, and I'm trying to think if there's because there's lots of there's lots of elements with this book that you can just tell, like the research that they did and everything that they had going on was really excellent.
yeah,
They took it very seriously. You could tell that this was um, a very well researched, well thought out. That they took their time. They worked hard on this book.
yeah,
It's not just I'm gonna blast out an episode, and there's nothing wrong
mhm,
with that either. Some of those
sure,
novels are very good.
yeah.
Um, I
The other
think,
thing is, the story here is so good, and it's such a good, I mean, almost a literal handoff, right?
yeah.
Between TOS and TNG, that I feel like it's a missed opportunity that we didn't get something this good in the movies.
Hmm. And yeah, it is. It is. Yeah, it is too bad we didn't get anything this good. But
Yeah.
well, and it's funny because the whole thing that started us doing this was actually an exchange we had on Twitter with Matt from Upper Pylon 2,
Hmm.
because he does not like reading. He's a big Star Trek fan, but he does not like reading tie-in novels.
Right.
He's not into them. And this whole thing started when basically I kept saying, like, well, you should read Federation.
Yeah.
If you read any Star Trek novel, you should read Federation. It's
Yeah.
so goddamn good.
Yeah.
And it had been, I think the last time I consumed it was through audiobook
Mm.
about 15 years ago. And actually, we should mention the audiobook because part of the connective tissue, ironically, is the abridged audiobook, and it's not quite as good because it's abridged and
Yeah.
shortened. But the abridged audiobook is read by Mark Leonard, who played Sarek.
Oh, cool.
And so it's not quite as good because they did shorten everything. But all the story elements are there. It's just a lot of
Yeah.
the details. It's not as good. And I
Hmm.
do not recommend. I recommend you get your butt in a chair, open a book, and read it
I
with
agree.
Federation. And you know, um, and heavily believe that if you were to read one Star Trek novel, this is the one.
Yep.
This, and after having read over 100 of these, there's several others that I could probably do a top 10 list of the
Hmm.
top tens that I like, but this is the only one that, if you're a Star Trek fan, that I say if you're going to read one Star Trek novel, you read Federation, because it
Yeah.
is, and partially because, and pretty much you see every person that reviews this, they say to themselves, like, man, we should have gotten this. We should have
Yeah.
gotten this.
Yeah.
So let's talk about First Contact, because that's the thing, is we
Hmm.
did get Zephyr Cochrane in the movies. And it makes me wonder, because all these dudes that were writing on Star Trek, and I have a lot of respect for Ron Moore and Brandon Braga, who wrote um, both Generations and First Contact. They've both
Hmm.
written a lot of excellent Star Trek. They've done a lot of excellent TV beyond Star Trek. I have a lot of respect for them. But I
Hmm.
wonder if if they wouldn't have stayed away from Zephyr Cochrane if they had read this book.
Yeah.
Um, because it's clear that they weren't reading all the Star Trek stuff. I mean, how could they? They couldn't. I
No.
mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
they actually they had jobs related to Star Trek. They probably were not going to sit on the bus going home reading Star Trek like I was.
Yeah. Hmm.
So I don't expect them to read all of them, but this is one where I would have been like, if you're going to talk Zephyr Cochrane, look how popular this book is. You
Hmm.
should check it out. They obviously didn't. Star Trek First Contact. Well, do we want to give our thoughts on Generations first?
Yeah, I suppose.
Because Generations, just to me, there's things I like about Generations.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, I like the Klingon sisters are great. Um, in a Grilka, and I think they're funny. I love the destruction of the Enterprise D. I think that scene works really well. That's something that they had wanted to do later. They had wanted to do it as a season 5 finale, actually. But they, one, didn't have the budget, B, didn't have the budget to do the effects of the actual scene, and did not have the budget to design a new Enterprise and do new models. So they scrapped it and said, we'll do that in the movie. And that scene is great, but all the stuff, the storyline with Kirk and Picard and the Nexus, first of all, it's not stakes worthy of Kirk giving his life.
Right.
Storyline. I agree with people that the stakes aren't high enough.
Well, I think the problem is they mention really early in the movie that if this star is destroyed, there is a habited planet, there a pre-industrial civilization there with a couple 100 million people on it. So that's, to me, that's high enough stakes, but they don't come back to it and hit it hard enough. You know, Picard doesn't really come up to Sauron and say, "Hey, you're going to kill 250 million people. Are you sure that you can do that?"
Well, and you could have easily fixed that by just saying that it would screw up the fabric of 20, 30 worlds with like the orbital mechanics of the entire region of the galaxy. You know? And I'm just spitballing off the top of my head, but like if you take, maybe instead of just the planet being destroyed, is if they had just, if the Nexus were to destroy the sun there. And you,
so this one, it feels like a television show. I mean, it, like the way it's directed, the way it's even written, it feels very Star Trek-y to me. But the execution of it is not fantastic. I don't think Patrick Stewart's very good in this movie. And I don't know why that would be, because he's usually excellent on the series. But all the stuff with his brother dying and that kind of stuff, I wasn't buying any of it.
Yeah, and Shatner's not particularly good either. He, you know, and it was fun, you know, like no, it wasn't. It was like it was a bad, like, I think all that stuff failed.
For me, the more compelling stuff was pre-Nexus, right? So the TOS send off with Starship Captain Cameron from Ferris Bueller's Day Off.
Harriman.
I actually kind of liked that part, and so I was watching that. I'm like, okay, you know, this is okay. I like this, but I think that's probably just my original series movie bias, because I like those movies so much more than the TNG movies.
Well, it could be. And the one thing that's interesting in that is that they had written all the crew in, and you only see Scotty, Chekhov, and Shatner because they're the only ones that were willing to do it. The rest were like, they wrote a version that had all of them, and Nimoy famously did not like the script, and actually Nimoy was vocal about the whole script. I think the original version might have had Spock and, well, no, it couldn't have had Spock because Spock's in TNG later. So so they couldn't have had that. But I know that Nimoy was very famously not into this script. And Brandon Braga has later said that Nimoy wasn't wrong. So I think the writers understand that they were rushing to do this right after the end of the series, and they probably could have taken more time.
I just
don't directed by an episode director who did not have a lot of film experience. But then again, Jonathan Frakes didn't have any when he did First Contact, and I think he made a movie. He made a Next Generation movie. I know you're a big fan of First Contact, but it feels like a Star Trek movie in the sense that it has the added elements that make
Yeah.
the movies feel like the humor, that everybody gets a role, all the stuff that worked in the Star Trek movies that worked.
Mhm.
Um,
Yes, exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, let's be clear. I mean, like I said, I'm more of a fan of the TOS movies, but I don't like all of them. And this is my main problem with the TNG movies, is I feel like, and I haven't seen the motion picture in a long time, and I like slow, boring science fiction more now, and so I would like to go back and watch that one again. But 2, 3, and 4 are one continuous story, right?
Mhm.
That they tie together really, really well, and you don't get that at all in the TNG movies. And did we need Generations? Did we need to cross them over? Because I feel like Star Trek 6 was a great place to leave that crew, and
Mhm.
I just don't think that Generations was necessary. So that's my main problem with that one.
Well, Leonard Nimoy agreed with you, because that
Yeah.
was one of the arguments that he made, is that we
Mhm.
don't need this, and like it doesn't help, and that's why
Mhm.
it's not like he wasn't willing to come back. He came back in '09.
Right.
And if he had the story that he wanted, he would come back, but he
Yeah,
didn't like that story. And so I know you're not a fan of First Contact, but we
yeah,
got to talk about First Contact. Like I personally, I have very mixed feelings on First Contact, because
right.
just as a standalone movie, I think First Contact is the best of the TNG movies.
Oh, by a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's a great Borg movie. It's a great Next Generation movie. My problem with it is that as a fan of Star Trek Federation,
Right.
when I saw the movie opening night in the theater in Syracuse, and I was still excited, but I was like, that's not Zephyrin Cochrane.
Right.
The guy's way too skinny for Zephyrin Cochrane. And as much as I like James Cromwell, he's not
Yeah.
acting like Zephyrin Cochrane. He's not anything like the guy I saw before.
Right.
And if and the problem that I have with First Contact is that one of my favorite Star Trek stories, Star Trek Federation, gets knocked out by a simple fact of, if Zephyrin Cochrane, if the events of Federation, now I've heard people say like, well, Federation can still exist because
Yeah.
Cochrane could have still gone out to Alpha Centauri, and there is some lip service to that in Enterprise. Because Judith and Garfield Reeves-Stevens, by the way, were writers on the final season of Enterprise.
Oh, nice.
And they couldn't save it. They were brought
I've
in
never
to
watched
save
it.
it. They were brought in to save Enterprise, actually.
Okay.
And
I have heard the 3rd season is the best season. But
the 3rd is the best, in my opinion, is the best season. But they did not learn from the story success of season 3 of Enterprise did not help save the show, because people were not watching. So then they overcorrected in season 4 in a lot of ways. And so for me with Enterprise, I like season 1 and season 3.
okay.
And season 2 and season 4 of Enterprise are hot garbage. And it's weird
It's
because
the opposite of the TOS movies.
yeah, exactly. Well, oh well, I mean, I'm a motion picture fan, so
Yeah. I like Star Trek 3, so
I
there's a
love
hot
Star
take
Trek
for
3.
you.
I love Star Trek 3. I'm with you there. I like the whole Genesis trilogy.
We
But
can all agree on Star Trek 5. So
yeah, everyone knows Star Trek 5 is
a turd.
And but here's the thing about First Contact is that if Federation was canon, then the whole crew of the Next Generation would have met Zephyrin Cochrane, and he would have died on Enterprise D, right? And they would have known him, so they wouldn't have been like freaked out about, hey, look, there's Zephyrin Cochrane, and and been so amazed by it. I think because, and also
you still could have had Barclay being uncomfortably.
You could, but at the same
enthusiastic.
time, they would also be saying like, well, he has to survive and he has to do this to get in the timeline because he has to get to us.
Okay. This brings me to my major gripe about First Contact.
Okay.
Right? The whole premise here, the Borg come in, lose a battle pretty badly because Picard swoops in at the last minute and tells him where to shoot.
Mhm.
Then they hand wave some time travel because the Borg can time travel, and I'm not sure why they're doing any fighting in the current century if they can time travel, but we'll leave that aside. So then they go, They end up firing at Earth, at the general area where Zephram Cochrane is. Are we really believing that they didn't kill anybody who was important to the timeline? So like I would stand and shout from the hills at what a great movie this was if it ended with them getting back, with the TNG crew getting back to their timeline and finding it slightly changed.
Yeah. That is
Or a Twilight Zone ending.
or that they figure out a way to try and to go back and stop the Borg.
Yeah.
That's not as fun of a story.
No, it's not. And okay, let me be clear about this, right? It's an enjoyable movie. There's no question. Like I watched it the other day and I'm like, okay, I get it. I know why people like this movie. But I feel like it has a lot of the same faults as the JJ movies do, where people are like, well, those are just action movies. I'm like, well, what is First Contact? It's not a philosophical movie.
Yeah.
So, and I don't like, I feel like Picard as a character is not treated very well in the movie, because I don't buy any of his arc. I don't buy that the bridge crew wouldn't have relieved him of duty when he was telling people to go back and stand their ground when he should have just been pushing the destruct button. I was talking to my friend Colin about this the other day, who's TNG, or my Take Me to Your Reader co-host. And he said, well, they couldn't relieve him of duty. Only the medical officer can. I'm like, Dr. Crusher was right there. So she totally could have. And I didn't get that. And I understand in the movie, you wanted to have the good moment with Lily, and the line must be drawn. Yeah. That whole moment. And it's a good moment. I'm not going to lie. It's just, I don't know. It's one of those ones where, like, while I'm watching it, I'm like, this is cool. This is all great. And then I go back and I think about it. I'm like,
yeah,
I don't know.
Which is the problem with the Abrams ones, is that they're enjoyable. Watching
they do not hold up on further review.
They do not hold
but
up.
I love them. So
yeah. See, I don't, but I do enjoy all three. Like while I was sitting in the theater, well, no, Into Darkness I hated throughout.
I have a lot of problems with Into Darkness.
Yeah, Into Darkness is bad, but and
Beyond, I felt like was more of a classic. Like it could have been an episode of the original series.
Yeah, Beyond is my favorite of the three.
Yeah.
And I have actually thought about rewatching it.
Yeah.
But so maybe we'll start summing up here, because I think like we've talked this book pretty good.
It's a lot to cover too.
Yeah, it is, but I think it justifies its hardcover and its classic nature. It's one of the only Star Trek books that got an anniversary edition, and for a reason. I think people love it. Now here comes a question that I have for you. If you could have like a Doctor Who like sonic screwdriver, and you could change the Star Trek continuum. Yeah. I actually don't know if the Doctor could do that. I don't know why I went there, but if you could change the Star Trek continuum and you could keep First Contact or keep Federation, you're definitely going Federation, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I did want to talk about this, right? Because the reason that this isn't filmable is, of course, you can't. What's great about the book is it's Picard at his TNG form, and it's Kirk in his prime. The movies, they have that edge of I'm getting older in them for the TOS movies. And so in order to make this into a movie, you would have had to change the era somewhat. And I feel like you could have done it pretty easily. It's instead of his personal log being discovered in 6 months, it's discovered 30 years later, or 10 years later, 20 years later.
Yeah. And then you'd have an older Cochrane too, which
exactly
could
well, no, you could still have him be young. You'd have to recast him, but that's no problem.
Yeah, and you couldn't do scene for scene. You couldn't do this technically. I did think about this a little bit. I think with CGI and voice actors, you could do a computer animated version of Federation.
Sure.
And with as much weird like Star Trek as we're getting now.
Yeah.
You could technically do it if you wanted to do like a Star Trek Legends thing. I think it would be amazing. That'll never happen.
No.
I'm fine with it existing as a book because it's a
Yeah.
great book. And what's cool for me is this is definitely, now that I think about it and I do the math, including listening to the audiobook, this is my fourth time and first time in probably 15 years, maybe. But I found everything just as exciting reading this time, especially the hostage scene, the rescue of the hostages, the singularity. I mean, there's moments in this book where you sit there and you're just, as a storyteller, and you look at how they pulled all these elements together, including the elements that are like explaining canon and doing all this.
Yeah.
This is an incredibly well-crafted book and
Agreed.
a story. It just happens to be in Star Trek.
Mm-hmm.
It couldn't exist without Star Trek, but it builds on everything, and it's really impressive. It takes the media tie-in to another level, and I do appreciate that. I mean, it's funny because, you know, in my review, I talked about how, like, every once in a while, like, some of my favorite authors who I have great respect for have written tie-ins for different franchises. Brian Evanson wrote an aliens novel that is like an awesome detective noir novel, just that happens to be set in the alien world. John Shirley wrote a Batman versus white supremacist novel in Dead White. And you know, Jeff Vandermeer has like a crazy Predator novel. Krista Faust wrote some really excellent prequels to Fringe. And which is one of my all-time favorite shows.
I love that show.
Yeah, you should read that. Their prequels. They're about Walter and Nimoy's character. I'm farting his name. I'm brain farting his name, but
Bishop.
Bishop. Yeah. And but in any sense, I'm farting his name. Yeah, my wife's laughing at me in the next room. But anyways, yeah. So let's wrap this up with. Final thoughts on Federation overall. We've kind of done that a little bit, but
no, it was a terrific experience. I really want to thank you for inviting me on and for putting the spurs to me about this one. I mean, I know you were telling me not to stress, but but for giving me something to add to my reading list that was just a pleasure, right?
Yeah,
and there's something nice about diving into something like this with characters that you already know, and it really does make the buy-in a lot easier. And so
and what's cool too is Federation has, with the Cochrane elements, it has stuff that you've never seen before. So there are, you know, with the Optimum and the and Thorn is just, it's like a killer villain, and I think it's the reason why this novel holds on with people. And see, you know, that's where Into Darkness should have been Adric Thorson. That would have been amazing instead of Khan. Yeah, exactly. Fantastic, dude. You could have had the same kind of intensity, and not, it would have felt better, because the problem with Into Darkness is that they could never reach the level of hatred. Let's keep making references to a movie that we're not going to be as good as. Yeah. You have to come up with your own. You have to, and it can be done. And Federation is a prime example that it can be done. And, well, yeah, maybe in a couple months we'll have to do Prime Directive, Seth. Okay. Because now that after reading this, I was like, oh, I remember now how good they are. They did write one Trek novel that wasn't quite so good. Their first one was called Memory Prime, and I think I've read that one too. Yeah, it takes place on like a computer world or something. I just remember they had not hit their stride with Star Trek quite yet. But the funny thing is, you know, they ghost wrote all of Shatner's Trek novels. Yeah. And it's funny because if you read those novels, you can see when they're getting more freedom compared to when they're like writing what Shatner's telling them to write. Right. And it's funny is when like in that Ordever interview, they refer to it as the Shatnerverse. because Shatner had the ability to make his own canon and like
Wow.
just kind of go off and so the Reeves-Stevens, they're not perfect in everything they've done in Trek. I don't think those Shatner books, it's not their fault. They were writing for Shatner, but some of those are not quite as good. But the DS9 one is really good. So yeah, so Federation, if anybody's listened this far, you must be a big fan of the book too. But you can always share your thoughts at Star Trek Arcs on Twitter and Seth follows me too. So, but you can add Seth and I if you want to talk about this book. We obviously loved it, and it's great fun. And it's the essential elements of Star Trek storytelling. And I think that people who want more Star Trek, it's like this is Ground Zero is as good as it gets.
Yeah.
And
yeah, I'm totally going to recommend this to friends of mine who I know are Trek fans.
Yeah, and I'd love to hear from them too, because we just I think the thing about Federation is the reason why people are evangelical about it is that it is one of the best Star Trek reading experiences you can have. There are and one of the things I've been doing lately, I just read a Picard novel recently too. The most recent Picard one is that I took it to a new level this time, whereas I put on Star Trek soundtracks while I was reading.
Oh, nice.
And especially that hostage scene when you got, I just happened to, in the queue, like I had Wrath of Khan music going on, and it just worked really well. And I was just I was really flowing and feeling it. And, I busted out 200 pages in a day in the middle of this. So
yeah, I did too.
Yep. All right. So Seth,
I want to go read that scene right now.
That's awesome. Yeah. Really, thanks for joining me, because I do want to send my listeners here to Take Me to Your Reader. I mean, I like both your podcasts. Who Goes There is regular for me. You lost me on the last Comfort Reads one a little bit because the Black Cauldron and stuff. I did listen to it, but I was like, that's definitely not my speed. But I was glad to learn about it from perspective.
I love those books, man.
Yeah, I know. And well, it's like I love the Lucky Star books, but I don't expect everyone to like those either. Because
I do expect everybody to like the Prydain books, but
but
that's what happens with something you really love, right? So
but I think the people that listen to this and that Take Me to Your Reader, what they will really enjoy about Take Me to Your Reader is and one of the reasons why I like your role in it is that I think that you worry about the differences in the plot, story, structure, and arc of things, and it's one of the reasons why I knew you were good for this, because like I trust you when I'm listening to Take Me to Your Reader that pretty soon Seth's going to bring this back to the structure of this story. And I always enjoy that. So Take Me to Your Reader. You want to give anybody last some links and stuff, or where they can find?
Take Me to Your Reader. The website is pavementpodcast.com for reasons that I won't go into, and Hugo's there is hugospodcast.com. And actually, our latest Take Me to Your Reader is also on the Black Cauldron. So
yeah, I know. I knew that was coming, but I just hadn't read those books, so it was good for me to listen, because I figured they're books I'm never going to read, but I do need to know about them. So they're just not in my wheelhouse, Seth. I'm sorry.
That's good. No, it's all good.
Yeah.
So with the Comfort Read series that I'm doing, right, I'm having people on and they're suggesting Jane Austen and all kinds of other things that aren't necessarily in my wheelhouse either. And so each one of the episodes, I want to go in with some amount of education. And sometimes I'm reading and I'm like, well, okay, this doesn't work for me, but I can ask them why it works for them. So
right. Well, that's good. And somebody's comfort read, who knows what, you know. Yeah, like Phil K. Dick is a comfort read for me, but that doesn't mean it is for anybody else. All right, Seth, it was great
Cool.
having you, and I'll stick around after we're done recording for a minute, but I really appreciate you coming on the show. This is a new podcast, and I appreciate any ears that you might bring to me. So I
Yeah,
love it. Thanks for
more than happy. Thanks for having me.